Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the first module of our talk here today. In the first module, I will introduce myself a little bit, and then we will spend about an hour speaking about our professional environment, the patients, the medical aid industry, and you can say the environment that we work in. So join me for that first hour. Martin Wucher was born in the middle of Namibia, near Windhoek, in a tiny little town north of Windhoek called Okahanya. I went to school in Namibia and finished school in 1987, and then went overseas for a bit, studied, and came back ultimately in 1989. And I opened a tiny little practice in Okahanya. At this stage, I work in Okahanya, which is 20 kilometers from our farm, and my wife, I'm married to Diana, does the farming operations. She runs 800 to 900 cattle, depending on the seasons. And as you will see there, these are my children. On the left is Tim, the oldest son. Then there's Kirsten, and then the youngest one. Tim is studying engineering, mechatronics. He's in his fourth year. Kirsten has basically finishing this year. She's doing BAc LLB, it's accounting and law. And our youngest daughter, Anna, is currently in America doing a gap year, riding horses, an endurance ride, and having a great time. This is the view from our farm. At this stage, this was about 2 months ago when it was nice and green. At this stage, it's all coming a bit yellow, and this is probably the time of the day that we're here early in the morning. Let's get back to dental school. You are a special group of people. You are special because you are here today, you are looking at the material at home, and you have taken the decision to come and improve something about the existing situation in your professional environment. If you think back, we all have got choices, like this gentleman at the bottom. You can either go right or you can go left. And as you know by now, choices, daily choices, will change your life. They have a small impact over the short term, but they've got a massive impact over your lifetime. What motivates you to become a healthcare professional? You know, when I speak to colleagues, and I think back at our dental school days or university days, there was a group of young, enthusiastic people. They were selected for specific skills. They had to be strong academically. They had to be willing to serve. They had to be willing to go through years and years of very, very tough training, spending many, many hours when other students were having a ball, and ultimately became professionals in their specific fields. 10 or 15 or 20 years later, if you speak to these people, often they're depressed, they're down. What's happened to their motivation? And what is the main reason? I believe when we start with our work, we have got a warped picture of the reality of healthcare. Healthcare comes from the inside, comes from the heart, and you use your God-given skills to serve the people around you. If you end up working in that sphere, you find that one big thing comes into it, and it rules our life eventually. Let's go back and think about school. You know, these guys that always were in trouble, that hardly ever passed, I call them the stoutgats. You have him here. He was scared of nothing. Very often, he had no tertiary education. In fact, he left school and he just did one job after the other. But these people have got guts and they're streetwise. And 10 or 20 years later, if you compare your life and their life, you think, what have I done wrong? Shouldn't I have been in a different place? These people have got something that we often battle with. They can work with money. And you will hear me speak about money a lot today. Money is not everything, but money is like oil in a car's engine. We need to have money to make things work, to have choices. Money is like blood and a body. You know very well, if there's no blood, there's no life. In fact, in surgery, if there's no blood, you know you're in trouble. So ladies and gentlemen, let's start with our professional environment. How do people cope? What do they do? Many of us have got this strategy. They just follow the masses. They do what everybody does. If everybody is contracted into a medical aid, they do the same thing. And sadly, in their subconscious mind, they believe if they do the same as everybody else, they will get a better result. They will not get a better result. They will experience the same results that everybody has. So if you want different results, you need to do something different. In other words, we need to change. We need to change our thinking, our behavior. Let's look at this quote from Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin, in his travels over many years, observed that it wasn't the strongest or the cleverest or the biggest animals that survived. He found and he saw clearly that the animals who could adapt to new situations the quickest could exploit that situation, and they could make use of it and then live in an environment that suited them. John Maxwell says people change for two reasons. They change because they see the light. Now you might be sitting there and intellectually understand that you need to do and learn new things. So you will be seeing the light. The other person will be in trouble and you will feel the heat. In other words, there might be a threat that he might not be doing it or making it financially anymore, so he has to come up with a new strategy to survive. So it's either see the light or we feel the heat. Okay, if we want to change, it's no use changing without a little bit of a strategy behind it. Let me give you an example. If you fly from Namibia, in other words from Windhoek to Joburg, and you arrive in Joburg, the first thing, if you phone your friend and you say, "Hey Pete, I'm in Joburg now, how do I get to your house?" What will he say? He normally says, "Where the hell are you? Just tell me where you are." And I would say, "Look, I'm still at the airport. I'm standing at exit number so and so." First of all, you have to know where you are. Secondly, you have to decide on how far you will get, the distance, how far will you travel. Thirdly, you have to make sure that your direction's correct. In this example here, the one way you will end up in Zimbabwe and the next direction will be in Cape Town. The distances are roughly the same from where I would depart, but the results and the positions on where you end will be vastly different. The last thing, all decisions are useless unless you add a fourth dimension, and that is time. If you plan something and you don't add a time factor, if your patients say, "Look, I'm going to lose 10 kgs to bring my body weight down," and he doesn't put a time span on it, when will he lose 10 kgs? If you stop smoking, if you get training in this and this and this, unless you do it and you say, "I'm going to do it now, in 3 months' time, in a year's time," it's useless. So to sum up, you need position, you need distance, direction and time. Let's look at our African environment. In Southern Africa, and this program focuses mainly on those areas because that's the healthcare environment that I know best. We have got very wealthy people. We've got high-end, I call them private patients. We've got the rural communities, we all know them. They have got nothing, and their main time and energy is spent just to get enough food and water, and probably on housing. So very, very basic commodities. On the other hand, we've got high-tech cities. Think of Joburg, Cape Town, big cities with absolutely European standards. Then we've got a group of medical aid patients. Roughly 7.5 million in South Africa are insured in some sort of medical aid. And then the huge masses of no-fund people. To get a better grip on how the finances work, I always like to go back to this income and expenditure survey. It gets done every 4 years, so the one we're looking at is unfortunately about 4 years old, but it still tells us an interesting story. The first thing we notice is that there are huge differences. There is a small group, you can say 10% of the population, which are very, very wealthy, and then you've got a huge group which is pretty poor. In fact, some of them are very poor. If you look at this slide here, you can say 10% of the people earn 50% of the total income in Southern Africa. This is amazing. So if you are in the 10%, you think South Africa is like everybody else in the 10%. If you're in the other 90 or 70% that don't earn that much, life is very, very different. As so-called haves, we tend to think that government programs that fund the poor are a waste of money, they're not constructive. In fact, they might even stimulate people not to work. But if you understand these statistics, you realize that they are crucial, they're important to keep these people alive, just to have them food, water, just housing, the basics. If we look at this slide, it actually beautifully illustrates the differences in racial groups, in income patterns. I would suggest when you sit at home, stop your DVD here and look at this carefully and study this slide. You will see that, for instance, the population, the black population, comprises roughly 80% of every South African. Yet, when it comes to earnings, the black population earns 41%. If you go back to the other end of the spectrum, you take the white population. The white population makes out about not even 10%, and yet they earn 45% of all income. So it's very, very skewed. And these are figures, these are numbers. There's no emotion, no politics. If we see this, we can understand that politicians have a great time hammering out the differences and then having the things that we read in the news every day. We have to understand that. I believe for our profession, it's not good, it's not bad, it's just the way it is. So I'm going to speak to you today as a private practitioner with a dental background. How do people spend their money? We've looked at how they earn their money. The main spending patterns are going to housing, transport, and foods. And this was done in 2006. And as you can see, the things that have increased in price since then are the same things that they spend. So if we assume that things are much the same today, we can understand that these are the main spending areas that people spend their money on. Once again, look at this graph. On the right there, you've got the 10% that earns 51% of all income. If you add the next 10% down to the left, you get another 17.8% and another 10%. So to sum this up, we can say 80% of all income goes to 30% of all households. Now, if you're in healthcare and you're a private practitioner that doesn't get a salary from somebody or other, which group are you going to approach with your business? Who are you going to sell to? Obviously, it's no use to sell to the 70% that get 20% of the income, because they will be spending their income on food and housing. They have to. In other words, we need to focus at the group that gets 80% of the income, which is 30% of the households. How do you find them? Easy. You open your eyes. You walk around the shopping malls on a Sunday. You look at their cars. You look at the clothes they buy. You look at how they spend on their kids. Kids are an emotional thing for us. And if you have any money, you will spend it on your kids. Most parents will spend more on their kids than they will spend on themselves. Let's look at this statistic here. At the bottom, we've got roughly 22 to 25 million patients that depend on the state. They've got nothing. They're called state patients. On top of that, they're not even employed by the state. One up, you've got roughly 14 million people in South Africa or Southern Africa that are working for the state directly or indirectly. In other words, the salaries coming from the state filtered down to the families. And it might be one person having, you can say, a job, and he has got 5 or 10 dependents. There are studies that in Southern Africa, in certain areas, one person employed might support up to 10 people at home. At the top, you will see there 7 million. It's actually a little bit more. It's 7.6, 7.8 million. We'll look at those statistics later on. And these people have got funding of some sort. They are insured by medical aids. Either open schemes, in other words, that everybody can join, or closed schemes. Closed schemes are schemes that are bound to their, you can say, employment. In other words, a certain government department or something. Only employees of that company can join that scheme. And you will see there once times National Health Reference Price List, twice and 3 times. So the top end, you can say they are financially independent. They can pay anything and they buy the best medical care they have. There's a new group, 2 to 3 million upcoming, emerging market new patients. These are very often the patients that come from disadvantaged backgrounds who have now got the possibilities to get better employment, to get medical aid insurance, to get a better income, and they start buying different products. They will buy a car, a very fancy car if they can afford it. They will spend on housing, on clothing. They will spend a lot on schooling, and they also spend on health. Often I hear and I say, look, these patients don't spend on health or teeth, but it will come. And they start doing that by spending on their children once again. If you look at the trends, in the 1960s, the buying power of the white population was in excess of 60%. In other words, 60% of the buying power was in the hands of the white customers. If you go back to about 2 or 3 years back, the white buying power has dropped to below 40%. And what we see in this statistic here is that the buying power from the black population has increased proportionally. In other words, they are now over 50%. The other two that we see here, the colored and Indian population, have stayed pretty constant. So in other words, things are being stable in those groups. Let's look at our friends. Friends or enemies? Are they good for us? Are they bad for us? Everybody has to make up their own mind. I would like to give you some backgrounds and show how medical aids work. Medical aids are quite a new thing. In other words, they've only been around since the 1880s. In other words, just over 100 years. In ancient times, what happened is we had a patient that had a headache. You know, we were living in very primitive societies. There might have been a witch doctor or a shaman. If you had a tummy bug or a headache and it wouldn't go away, you would go and see him. And he would do certain procedures, he would perform certain rituals, and you would have to pay him. It could have been a chicken, a goat, depending on what the ailment was and how he sorted you out. Then people became more sophisticated. They moved into cities or smaller towns, and where there was a doctor. Doctors long ago were highly trained individuals. They had much more training than the average person around. They could read and write well. They had a lot of medical knowledge, and they could look after your grievance and ails and pains. And in a little, if you can say, a little dorpie, you could go along and you could possibly even bring him some cold meat or bring him a chicken again. He would actually help you still. Things started to change. In 1880, or in 1870 to 1880 in Europe, it was a time of the Industrial Revolution. And in the Industrial Revolution, everybody flocked to the bigger centers. It was very much like it is in South Africa today. We've got the rural populations coming to the bigger centers hoping for some sort of employment or a job, because their families and friends that live in the big cities, they often show and exhibit an affluent lifestyle. When they get there, in the 1880s they had to work in big factories, they lived under crowded conditions, and ultimately they were very often sick. They had TB and all these diseases that we get when people live in crowded conditions. So the factories suffered because people were sick. They couldn't go to the city doctor with a chicken or a goat. There they needed money. And because they were always at the marginal, at the lower end of the income, they didn't have money for health. So in 1881, Bismarck in Germany, they initiated some laws. And the laws said that half the contribution gets taken from the employer and half the contribution gets taken from an employee. And they started a kitty, a savings system for health. And this savings kitty had a non-profit clause in it. In other words, it was only to be used for health. Nobody was allowed to use it for anything else. And it worked very, very well. Whenever somebody was sick, they would use from that funds and send them to the doctor, and the doctor would be reimbursed by that system. And in no time, there was a lot of money lying around. And when there's lots of money lying around, business people come along and they see an opportunity. In this case, it was the insurance industry. The insurance industry decided that they could do something with that money. They would market these services, and then they would manage these funds, because they knew that they couldn't make a profit out of those funds straight away. But what they said is, if we administer those funds, we would be paid a certain fee for administration. This is when administrators came into play. And this is what we have here today. We've got a patient at the bottom and an employer. They put money into what they think is a medical aid, and the money of the medical aid goes actually to administrators. Medical aids like to think that they only charge, as you can see in this picture, 5 to 8% of what they get. The reality is different. They charge much more, and times have been where they charged up to 22% of every rand that they got for administration. Let's look at the figures. A basic principle of capitalism or of making money is you can use other people's money, you can use other people's time, or you use their labor. This is leverage. In other words, you organize it all and let them work for you. They will get some money out of it, but you will get the most. And this is what Marx noted and recognized, and he built his whole philosophy on that. We'll get back to that just now. So now, as I've shown you, we've got a medical aid, and above it is an administrator. And sometimes the administrator is part of a holding company, and the holding company again has got interest in all sorts of other, you can say, business deals. So the medical aid is actually being bypassed. It's a virtual body because the money really goes from the member to the administrator. The medical aid is just a shell. It's just a thing, something on paper. And the administrator does all the handling of the money. The administrator will collect it and it'll pass it on. Claims will be paid back to the service provider. What's interesting though, and I will repeat that a couple of times today, the patient for the medical aid is the income side. We, as providers, are the cost side. So when we think about this carefully, and as any clever businessman will do, you always need to keep down the cost side, and you always want to boost your income side. So in other words, in this scenario, you would be lifting the fee, the contributions that the patients will have to pay to me, but at the same time install all sorts of rules and regulations to limit the expense. In other words, limit anything that will be leaving the system, paid to doctors. Hospital payments. You know, in Namibia there was an interesting thing. It was, you know, we had adverts in the paper that boosted hospital plans. And sometimes I had patients coming in for dental implants, which are considered expensive procedures. The quotation would be 10 to 15,000 rand. They would leave, go to their medical aid and come back and say, the medical aid says it's okay if we do that in the hospital. And I was flabbergasted. It just didn't make sense to me. Why would you incur more costs if the same procedure could have been done in a chair? And it took a couple of years until it dawned on me that for some reason or other, in the constellation where a medical aid and possibly a hospital have got some sort of beneficial agreement, it would make sense that the money gets taken from the right pocket, in other words, paid from the medical aid shown to the patient, and it goes into the left pocket, or vice versa. In other words, a patient would come, somebody would do the procedure in the hospital, which would cost just about double, because hospital fees, say, fees for anesthetics, ward fees, all that stuff would be added. Let's look at this advert here. Oxygen. Oxygen is a hospital plan. And if you look at all these, take your time and look at this slide carefully. You can see there, let's look at the third question. What makes Oxygen unique? Oxygen gives you 25% of your annual premium back in cash if you do not claim within a benefit year. Let's just think about this carefully. They are saying that you give me 1,000 rand for a year to keep for you. If you need that money, I will pay you that money for whatever services you require. If you're not going to use that money at all, I'm going to give you 250 rand back, and I will keep 750. This is weird. This is crazy. But we do it every day. Just think a little further. Imagine going to the bank and saying, look, I want to start a savings account for medical emergencies. Now, the bank will say that's great, but just remember, unfortunately, we can only give you back 85 cents for every rand that you deposit, because the rest is administration fee. And we also have to tell you that if you don't use that money within a year, you have to start from scratch every year. Ladies and gentlemen, these things happen every day. And yet, in the banking world, we would never dream of entering into a deal like that. But because we are scared, fear, and I will talk about this extensively. Fear makes us do things that make no sense logically. Because medical aid funds are businesses. They employ the most intelligent people, highly qualified actuaries, to work out that they always come out tops. It's like a casino. Whatever happens to you and whatever story you hear as to how much money has been paid for this and that medical case, they still come out tops. Have you ever watched a casino where one of those little one-armed bandits throws out 10,000 rand? I'm sure you've seen it. That's a massive amount of money. And yet the casino will still make a profit. So we have a similar system here. Okay, we have got patients and employer. It goes to medical insurance administrators, and as I've mentioned earlier on, the holding companies in some cases have got other interests. They have got some interest in other hospitals, they've got interest in insurance and others. So it's a whole, you never see these things. You only learn about them when you look at their shareholdings, when you deal with shares. And I became aware of this in my time of doing my own share portfolios. It's a very interesting thing to do. It's fun, and you learn a huge amount. And I will be referring back to the Joburg Stock Exchange every now and then. Let's look at the basic relationships in healthcare. First of all, we've got a patient. It could be you or me or anybody. The patient has got a problem, so there's a need. And out of the need comes a person who can help this person. There's a provider. And between the two, the moment there is an interaction, in other words, the provider does something, he gets paid for it, there is a service. This is the fundamental of healthcare. But then somebody else came up, third-party funding. And nowadays, what happens is that the triangle works differently. Let's play out a few different scenarios. What happens if the patient's gone in this constellation? Can there still be healthcare? No. What happens if the provider's gone? In other words, there's no doctor, no physiotherapist, there's no biokineticist. What happens then? No service. What happens theoretically if there's no medical aid? Could it still function? In theory, of course. Because all the players that are there to make the service work are there. The issue is the finances. But there's nothing stopping finances flowing between the service provider and the patient directly. It's the oldest, simplest business model that we have. Every street vendor, every little person that cooks bits of meat on the side of the road, that sells telephone credit cards or whatever they sell, this is how it works. He gives you something, you pay. Finished. Straightforward. If he's too expensive, you won't buy from him. If he's too cheap, he'll go bankrupt. If he's good, you'll repeat buy. If he's not good, you do it once and you don't go back. Simple, efficient. We end up with something like this. It's a warped relationship and it's a complicated relationship. And ultimately, I believe we cannot create value like this. In fact, I believe we trap value like that. Now, what happens to the money that we spend on medical aid every year? We've got 7.8 million, 7.9 million people insured in South Africa. And last year, they spent 74 billion. That is 74,000 million rand. It's a lot of money. Where did that money go? Have you thought about it? Let's look. If we want decent figures, it's easy. You can go to the internet and you go to the Council for Medical Schemes, and they've got a lovely annual report. It sums up everything. And if I stand here and speak to you, I have to make sure that my figures and facts are absolutely sound. So for me, it's easy. I go to these things and I pull them out and I show them to you. and you choose, you make your own decisions on what you think is right and wrong. I believe we all understand that we need medical aid funds, but we as service providers have to be absolutely aware of how they work and how they influence our businesses. First of all, you can see the grey area at the bottom. These are the payouts. 72%, that's the straight claim. In other words, that's the money that comes from the so-called risk account. Then there's a little brown section at the top, 12.4%. That's what they call the savings account, and I'll speak about that a little bit now. The rest, those little pieces at the top, is money that you will never see again. In other words, we call it non-healthcare costs. Let's look at it in detail. The red part at the bottom, if you look at that slide at the bottom, it's called total hospitals. It's 37%, which is the biggest chunk of everything. The next biggest chunk is the blue at the top right. 21% is for medical specialists. In other words, the medical specialities, we can assume when a patient ends in a medical speciality, he's very sick. So that's the next highest chunk. What's interesting as well, many medical specialists work in conjunction with hospitals. So there is a close relationship between these two cost factors. The third biggest group is medicines. In Southern Africa, medicines were one of the highest until 2004, 2005, and then government got upset. They found it, you can say, it wasn't right in their world. So they employed a couple of laws, and it has come down drastically. But hospitals have been growing. So hospitals are the main chunk, medical specialities and medicines. If you look at general practitioners, the green section, you can call the others supplementary and allied health professionals. That's physiotherapists, all the professions that are supporting professions. Dentists and dentist specialists, together dentists and dental specialists take 3.8%, whereas the dentists get 3% of the whole cake. What about the savings account? How does it work? Now, in recent years, patients have become unhappy with the fact that if they don't claim a year, they have to start from scratch every year. And they started complaining. And it makes sense because they've got the feeling that they're saving money, but they can't use it later on. So third-party funders came up with quite a clever idea. They said, all right, we'll create a savings account, and that you can roll over. In other words, you can take it from year to year to year, and if you don't claim, you can actually build up your funds. What is a bit tricky though, and what most people don't realize, when you start claiming, listen carefully, when you start claiming, the administrator will take your savings account first. Let's look at the facts. If you compare these two graphs, if you look at the left, that's your savings account. Can you see the huge yellow part? That's for medicines. Then you go down, supplementary and allied health professionals. That's you and I. And the blue, medical specialists. General practitioners, they are big chunks. In other words, if you go to any of these groups, your savings account will be used first. If you go to the right side and you look at the benefits from the risk pool, you can see that the hospitals are funded from what they call a risk pool. In other words, medical aids will use your savings for the left graph, and they will use their actually duty, or you can say their account, for the right one. In other words, for hospitals, medical specialists, and medicines. What's happened and what comes from this report, and I will give you some time to read this slide because I think it's important. This is cut and pasted from the last annual report the Council of Medical Schemes. And the conclusion to me is important. They basically say, this shows that schemes have gradually been shifting benefits from the risk pool into medical savings account, which suggests that members have increasingly been paying more benefits out of their own pockets. My question is, if patients are paying more out of their own pockets, why can't they pay me directly? Why does it have to go via the administrator? Isn't that the oldest, best model we have? Some other statistics. Every time you compare these, you look at the left graph and the right graph. In other words, the risk contributions and the risk claims, for instance. It's the blue and the yellow. And you look at the difference between the two. The little difference between these two columns is always the amount that stays with the medical aid funds or with the administrator. The same on the savings contributions and the savings claims. If you want to study this, just push pause and sit and look at this carefully. I think it's really interesting. You've got the time at home to do it, so just sit and do it. Let's look at the risk claims, at the claims ratio. The columns are the risk contributions and the claims. In other words, the difference between the two columns is what stays with the medical aid. And then another way to show this is the little orange line going up and down. When the line is up, it actually means that you're getting more money out of what you saved. If the line goes down, the medical aid retains more, and you see it by the columns, by the difference in the columns. So if you look at this graph again, in 1989, the claims ratio was 96% or 90, make it 93%. So only 7% was kept by the administrators, which I believe is fair. Then it dropped down. The worst year was 2004. And you can see that it was 78% was paid back. In other words, 22% of everything that was paid in as a contribution was kept in their kitty. And I think that's not fair. I mean, nearly a quarter of all the funds that got into their coffers was kept there. Let's look at this graph. Once again, take your time, study this. It's from 2000, you can say, to 2009. The different professions get different shares. Top is once again the hospitals. The second highest group there, the light blue one, is medical specialties, and the third highest is medicines. This is the growth. You can see the growth in their contributions, in other words, in the money that they're getting. The hospitals, the big industry, the expensive hotels, take the biggest chunk out of medical aid payouts. What about the brokers? You know, the guys that sell the insurance. Last year they got 1.1 billion. For what? If we go back to the report, we find there that they say at the bottom, the substantial increase in broker service fees are clearly not being matched by increase in new members. How does that work? Let's have a look. If you look at this graph, on the left, you can see that, for instance, Discovery Health is growing like anything. Every year, their membership's increasing. At the same time, MedScheme Holding shows a downtrend. Okay? And if you got to the right of this graph, on the right side where it says other, there's also a downtrend. So what's happening? The broker will come along and he'll ask you and he'll say, look, we haven't seen each other for 2 years. How are you doing with your medical aid? And we will say, okay, some of it is good, but there are some claims that we have got problems with. They don't get paid and there's always some issue about it. He says, you know, you're not the only one who says that. There are so many people that say that. But let me tell you, I've got a new person. I've got a new group. And generally, people are very happy with them. So he gives you the new contract, and what you do is he basically moves from one medical scheme to the other. And the moment you sign on the dotted line, what happens? In all likelihood, that broker gets his commission guaranteed for 2 years. So after you have signed on that line, there's no incentive for him to come and see you again. Why? Because his deal's been sold. Only if you stop paying will he come and see you. Because if you stop paying, his medical aid will say to him, listen, Vucha has stopped paying, you better sort him out. And he'll come to you and he'll say, listen, don't stop paying, you'll lose all your benefits. Imagine if your child's in an accident tomorrow. He comes with a fear scene and you carry on paying. If you don't pay for 1 month, you lose everything that you might have been paying for 10 years. You lose everything. Think about it. Anyway, so this is what's happening. They move customers from one group to the other and make money out of it. This is how insurance industries work. Now, for allied health, look at this one. Study this. Next time patients come and complain in your practice, show them the starter. My question is, if you only get so little back for specific things, why do you need insurance? You can pay them yourself. Each one of us has to decide themselves. So to sum up, we are highly dependent on the medical aid industry. And we will refer to this in further chapters and further modules, and we'll try and analyze and get a better picture about it. What's the solution? Where's the real money going? If a financial magazine can quote things like this one, in other words, there's lots of money in health and wellness, why doesn't it come to the providers? Where does it go? Let's take a big group as an example, hospital group. We've seen that our hospitals are taking a lot of the medical payouts for that funding. Netcare is a very, very active, very dynamic and excellent hospital group. Look at their financial highlights. It's fascinating. A 54% increase in group revenue to 11.6 billion. That is money, guys. That's proper money. That's not peanut money. Let's look at the profits. Operating profit up 30% growth. That is huge. That is massive. Once again, look at their forecast. That was last year, but look at their forecast. Does that look like a company that's doing well? I really think so. And I acknowledge their business skills. They are wide awake, they deliver a good service, and they earn good, very good money for it. Let's look at another group. I think we all know this group. They're in the insurance, and they're very innovative. In other words, they've brought in schemes to make patients healthier, to limit disease, and yet again, they are very, very good business people. All the things that we as practitioners often neglect. We are good clinicians, but are we good business people? I think we can learn from these people here, from these companies. Let's look at this quote. Performance over this period exceeded expectations. And then comes the real issue. Through our network with healthcare professionals and private hospitals, costs were kept under control. The costs were kept under control, and the next sentence says, operating profits rose by 22% to 475 million. What are they saying? We've made a deal with the hospitals, and we've managed to keep salaries for providers low. And that's how we made our profit. That's what it says in business terms. These are some highlights for this year, right now. Operating profit up 32% to 1.7 billion. out of ensuring health care. Look at the share price. Look at this. So what about us? What about the guys who actually have to do the physical work? Where do we come in? Once again, I've shown you this picture. It's an interesting, sit and study this. If you are a dentist, and I'm referring back to my own profession, look at the graph. The growth from 2000 to 2008 has been just about zero. If I want to start a business, does it make sense to go into a model that supports my practice by these guys spending less and less on my profession? Obviously not. It's crazy. Have a look at your profession. Analyze what you see and then decide that, make your own decision whether you can go into that group or not, and understand that if they don't grow, if you're a medical specialist, you might be okay. If you're a hospital, you're doing fine. If you're selling medicines, you might also be doing fine, but the other groups aren't growing. Let me show you this to you're all intelligent. You know what to do. We like a cozy place. We like comfort. We want to feel safe. When we were little, this was a cool place to be. We felt great. But ladies and gentlemen, I believe we've got onto a stage where we have to make a decision. As in this picture, by the way, this is a genuine road sign in our little town of Okahenia. It says Voortrekker Street on the top, and it says Dr. Fox Street on the other side. You choose which road you're going to travel. How do we do this? Remember, we are on the bottom line. We get capital from the bank, we buy stuff from our suppliers, we learn, we get CPD, we acquire new technologies, and then we work. But wealth creation is at the top. So unless you get involved in managing your practice, you will never optimize this system. And the big guys know that, and that's what they do. They manage and others work for them. What's the solution? Let's go back to the insurance industry. The insurance industry tells us, cut out the middleman. Who's the middleman? Why can't you and I deal with our patients directly? And this is why I stand here today and I talk to you with confidence. In my little town, I've got no contracts with any medical aid anymore. I don't send accounts, and I believe anyone can do that in a lesser or greater extent. It all starts up here. It starts in our head, and we can take it from there. Current trends: private practice, less and less are contracted in, more and more practitioners are going private. So ladies and gentlemen, to conclude the first module, I want you to sit back and really think, couldn't you do without medical aids? I believe you can, if you really want to. And we'll spend the rest of these modules, or the rest of the day, investigating techniques to help you with this decision.